Boldwood presents New Beginnings on Railway Lane, written by Alison Sherlock, and read by Holly Hales. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Dear Miss Smith, thank you for your recent application for the position of hotel manager. Unfortunately, Katy Smith slammed down the lid on her laptop. Another day, another rejected job application. It was a disaster. She was no longer in control, and everything was falling apart. Her worst fears had come true, and she felt ill to her stomach with the anxiety of it all. I think that's everything. She looked up at her ex-boyfriend, Gerard, someone who she had dated for 2 years. Someone, as it turned out, she didn't know very well at all. He was hovering near the front door of the apartment, holding the last bag of possessions that he had spent the past hour packing up. He had moved in almost exactly a year ago, and she could briefly recall the excitement that she had felt at not being alone anymore. She swiftly dismissed the memory. And the front door key? She asked, deliberately keeping her voice in a level tone. I'll leave it here, he said, placing it on the sideboard nearby. Katy turned away, unable to bear to look at him any longer. Instead, she stared out across the lounge from her vantage point at the dining table. It was a modern one-bedroom apartment in a newly built block with a view over Clapham Common. It was only 5 minutes from the nearest tube station, and therefore only half an hour's commute from the hotel where she had worked until 1 week ago. Of course, now that she was unemployed, perhaps she would have to forego the desirable address without Gerard's share of the expensive rent. She didn't care about having to move, though. It was just 4 walls. It didn't mean anything to her, just like anywhere else she had ever lived since her family life had come to an abrupt halt all those years ago. Yeah, well, sorry again, she heard Gerard say. Katy shrugged her shoulders in response and kept looking away until she heard the front door close with a click. Finally, she sagged back against the dining room chair and let her emotions rush in for a moment. She wouldn't cry, of course. Gerard didn't deserve any tears, and she certainly wouldn't waste them on someone like him. But she did let her arms wrap around her trembling body, willing herself to find the inner strength that had got her through life so far. She could overcome this. After all, she had got through far worse. What was one lousy cheating boyfriend compared to that? Still feeling shaky, she got up to wander into the kitchen and opened up a bottle of white wine before pouring herself a much-needed large glass. The kitchen was also very modern, but barely used, with only an empty pot noodle in the bin next to the sink. Not exactly a well-rounded meal, but it was either that or toast or takeout again for dinner. Gerard hadn't been any kind of cook either. On the rare occasions that they were both at home at the same time, they ordered takeout. Normally they were at their different offices, of course, busy climbing the career ladder, or socialising at working dinners with business colleagues. There would be no more working dinners while she was unemployed, though, which didn't bode well because Katy had absolutely no culinary skills, something she shared with her father, although that hadn't stopped him investing heavily over and over in the restaurant trade in her childhood. But his business acumen was just as poor as his cooking, as the many failed businesses had proved. It had finally come to a head with the bankruptcy that had abruptly ended their secure, happy family life. She took a sip of wine from the glass and headed back into the lounge. Would it seem odd without Gerard living there? She looked around the apartment in a daze. In all honesty, she would barely notice. He was a workaholic like her. He worked long hours at an exclusive law firm, and she, until a week ago, had worked even longer hours at an upmarket hotel on Park Lane in central London, where she had been deputy hotel manager. She had hoped that by the end of the year, she would have been promoted to the top job as manager within the high-end hotel chain. She had worked so hard over the years, as well as taking many business courses in her limited spare time. But wide-sweeping job losses had suddenly been announced, and she had been stunned to learn that she was on the list for an immediate redundancy. It had upset her terribly, and she had been reeling from the shock ever since. She didn't even care much about the generous severance package she had received. As far as she was concerned, it was a matter of pride. She had never been made redundant before. She had worked her way up the career ladder, almost all the way to the top. Each job, just like her whole adult life, had been under total control. To be without control was to attract failure and heartache, and that would never, ever happen again. She lived by such a strict code of control that everything had to be in order, even the apartment that she had chosen to rent. The lines of the walls and ceilings were straight, the decor white and clean. There was a lack of anything personal, and that was just the way she liked it. Apart from the photographs on the sideboard, there was nothing to make anyone aware that it was even her apartment at all. She had earned a decent wage over the years and had managed to build up a healthy savings account, but had never bothered to spend it on anything for the apartment, or anywhere else she had lived. It was just bricks and mortar. What was the point? Her only luxury, the only time she felt that small thrill of self-indulgence, was her love of expensive shoes. The higher the heel, the better. It was daft and ridiculous, but they always made her feel powerful, and, she rarely admitted to herself, a tiny bit wild as well. Those boxes full of designer leather in her wardrobe made her feel alive, as if she really wasn't missing out on an exciting life, despite working all the hours in the day. In her bare feet, she felt small and ever so slightly worthless. Taking another, much larger drink from her wineglass, she went over to the sideboard. She barely looked at the photo frames these days, always rushing past or busy working on her laptop at the table. This time, though, she looked a little closer at the two photos. The frame on the left was a faded photo of her parents on either side of her, both holding her hands, when she was 6 or so years old. Her mum looked a little weary, as she always did in those days. Living with a force of nature like her husband would do that to a woman. He was always striving for the bigger and better adventure, until it had all come to a crashing halt that Christmas Eve, 14 years ago. They had all just settled down with a mug of hot chocolate and a mince pie to watch the Muppets' Christmas Carol when the knock on the front door had come. In retrospect, only Katy and her mum had been shocked at the sight of the bailiffs at the threshold. Her dad hadn't been at all surprised, having hidden the large amount of letters demanding payment for the ever-increasing business debts over many months. In the early days of the business, ever the optimist, Katy's dad had signed off a personal guarantee to start up a brand new restaurant. But it had failed, meaning that all assets, such as the family home, would have to be used to pay off the substantial debt. They would lose everything. Having already shut down the restaurant, the bailiffs swiftly cleared out most things from the house to repay some more of the debts. Katy and her mum could only stare on in horror as the television and even the Christmas presents had been taken away. "It'll be okay," her dad kept telling them both, but even his usual charming smile was a little less vibrant that evening. "We'll be fine," he had carried on. "We'll find somewhere else to live. What's life without a bit of adventure, eh?" It was the same excuse that he had always used, which had meant that she had spent her childhood being dragged from one city to the next, Katy and her mum trailing behind her dad, as he searched for his next dream. Over and over, he told them that the next place would be different, that the next adventure wouldn't end in failure, but it always had. But this time, he had gone too far. This time, they wouldn't even have a roof over their heads for much longer. Katy was now an adult, and at 18 years old, could make her own choices as to her future. At that exact moment, standing in the living room of their rapidly emptying family home, she decided that she didn't want any more adventures or surprises in life. She wanted rock-solid stability, and had been seeking it ever since. So, she had abandoned her beloved history A-level course at college, and the future place at university as well. There was no way that she could stay in control without an income, and took the first job she could find, which was a chambermaid at a nearby hotel. Whilst her parents' marriage and lives fell apart in the background, Katy worked all the hours that she could to start becoming independent of her dad's dreams. Pretty soon, her income was needed to support both Katy and her mum. Her dad borrowed some money from a friend and fled to the Far East, sending only a text to his daughter with a promise to send for them both when he was settled. The promise, like everything else he had ever vowed, had never come true. He had quickly moved on to another life with another woman and, soon afterwards, another child as well. Back in England, Katy's mum had struggled to overcome the shock of how swiftly her life had fallen apart, so for the next couple of years, Katy had had to become the strong one, the parent, whilst they both picked up the pieces of their lives that her dad had destroyed and tried to find their way forward. She worked long hours at the hotel and was so thorough with her duties that she was soon promoted to housekeeper. Then, over time, she had moved up into a supervisor role. With her determined nature and complete lack of social life, she had been like a whirlwind in each place she had worked. The hotels tended to be a complete mess behind the scenes. She went in, worked hard to sort out all the mayhem so that it was orderly and smooth, and then left once it was a well-oiled machine and, more importantly, before she got too close to anyone. It was for the best, she would tell herself, despite the aching loneliness. It would keep her from getting hurt that badly ever again. Her eyes moved across to the other photograph, which was of her mum and her lovely Irish stepdad, who had been married for almost 10 years. They had met on a tour of Scotland and now lived in a modest home in Cork. Katy hadn't visited as often as she would have liked, due to her work commitments, but theirs was a comfortable home, and her mum was finally happy and secure with a gentle, loving husband whom she could trust wholeheartedly. Her dad, meanwhile, was still searching for that next adventure in Asia, for something always just out of reach. Perhaps he was still embarrassed about what had happened all those years ago. Katy would never know, as she refused to answer the phone to him on the rare occasions that he bothered to call, wanting to spare herself from any more hurt. She sighed, as always, the thought of her selfish father bringing on darker and more negative thoughts, and that just wouldn't do. That kind of attitude hadn't helped her survive the mess of her late teenage years. She glanced down at the spare front door key that Gerard had placed at the end of the sideboard before turning away. She was alone again, at the age of 32, and that was fine. That was absolutely how she wanted it. She spoke to her mum once a week, and that was the sum total of her personal contacts. She didn't need or want anyone else in her life, despite any gentle nagging from her mum. But, for some reason, that evening, the breakup of her relationship was hurting her far more than she had ever expected. After all, it wasn't as if she had truly loved Gerard. Their moving in together had been more convenient than anything else, when the lease on his own apartment had run out. Truthfully, she had never felt that burning, couldn't-live-without-him passion that others spoke about. She had never loved anyone except her parents. Gerard had been a mirror image of her own hard-working personality, except it had turned out that he found time in his busy schedule to fall for an accountant at his law firm called Kimberly. "I couldn't stop myself from falling in love with her," Gerard had sheepishly told Katy when he had finally confessed his affair. "She's all I can think about. I'm sure you know what that's like." No, thought Katy. She didn't, and never wanted to either. To trust someone completely with her heart, it was unthinkable to her. She drained her glass and headed back into the kitchen to retrieve the wine bottle from the fridge. Then she grabbed her laptop and sat on the sofa, refilling her glass and drinking it in a daze. She didn't normally drink to excess. In fact, she didn't do any kind of overindulgence. But she felt out of sorts and, for once, was willing to throw caution to the wind. By the time the bottle was almost empty, and fueled by alcohol on a nearly empty stomach, Katy was feeling much more optimistic. Of course she hadn't reached a dead end with her career. Of course she was still in control. The right job just hadn't come up, that was all. Who wouldn't want to employ someone like her? She was perfect, organised, a machine. She gave a start at the words she had used to describe herself. Well, okay, she had feelings, didn't she? She just didn't give in to them. Better to suppress any emotions than to let them run away and cause catastrophes like an unexpected bankruptcy on Christmas Eve. What word had Gerard used to describe her earlier that evening as he made his excuses? Distant. Ha! What did he know? He was weak, just like her father. It would be nice, she thought, to find a man who could be just as strong as she was, perhaps even more so. Someone to lean on in those rare occasions when she needed it. A real man. But where on earth was she going to find one of those? She picked up the bottle and poured the last dregs of wine into her glass. But somehow she missed, and some of it spilled onto the glass coffee table instead. Katy immediately got up to retrieve a dishcloth to wipe up the mess. No mess, no fuss. That was her mantra. Everything had to be just so. After she returned the cloth to the kitchen sink, she glanced at her reflection in the mirror above the sofa. Her expensively cut dark long hair hung in a perfect sheet around her shoulders. No kinks or waves tolerated. Her makeup was delicate and natural looking. Her body slim. No excess allowed there either. As she sat down heavily on the sofa, she realised that she really was quite drunk. She opened up Google and stared at the flashing cursor. She had tried every job site, every recruitment search engine, for work as a senior manager in the hospitality sector, but those jobs were scarce. What next? There had to be a solution. There had to be a job out there that she was perfect for. She picked up her glass and drained the final drops of wine. Think, she told herself. There's always a solution to every problem. What was she good at? What did she have to offer? She instantly thought up her answer. She, Katy Smith, was the most organised person in the country, capable of dealing with absolutely anything. She smiled as she haphazardly typed the description of herself into the search engine. There must be someone out there who wanted skills like that. Who wouldn't? After hitting search, Katy leaned forward to squint at the newest result. Was she seeing things? Nope. It was real. Wanted, the most organised person in the country. Do you love a mess? Then come to Cranfield, because we have just the position for you. We have a temporary but fantastic job opportunity for someone who has excellent administrative and organisational skills, with an eye for detail and a logical mind. Bed and board included. She read the advert in disbelief before giving a whoop of joy. Good things always came to those who deserved them, she reminded herself. She was pretty muzzy-headed after all the alcohol, but it seemed to be the perfect job opportunity, presumably in hospitality, as bed and board were mentioned. There was no mention of salary, but she had enough savings to cover her bills if it wasn't well paid. Also, it was only a temporary position, but that was fine too. By the time she had the place in Cranfield ship-shape, another far better job was bound to have come along. Where was Cranfield? She guessed it was a suburb in one of the big cities somewhere. She had always been an urban person, hating the chaos and lack of order in the countryside, and had managed quite successfully to avoid straying away from the light pollution of major cities. The countryside was most definitely for other people, certainly not her. She swiftly typed out her reply, emphasising all of her skills and experience. Even in her drunken state, she knew to spell-check the email and double-check for grammatical errors. After all, it was vital to appear professional, even for a temporary position. After one final read-through, she gave a sigh of relief, grateful to be in control once more. Katy pressed the send button on the email before she passed out on the sofa, with a triumphant smile on her face. Chapter 2. You've done what? Ryan Connelly stared at his younger brother, Ethan, in utter disbelief. He couldn't believe what he had just been told. I posted an advert online for someone to tidy this place up, repeated Ethan, with a shrug. I thought it would help you and Dad out. Ryan glared at him. We don't need help, he replied. Ethan rolled his eyes before staring around the living room, barely able to disguise his grimace at the state of the place. "You truly believe that, bro?" Ryan followed his brother's look around the chaotic and messy family home, already knowing the state of the place before his eyes reminded him. No, of course he didn't believe what he was saying. But what other choice did they have but to battle on by themselves? The apartment above the railway station in Cranfield had been Ryan's family home since he was born 33 years ago. But it had been in the Connelly family for many decades before then. His great-grandfather, his granddad, and his dad all had the railways in their blood and had loved working on the trains and at the station. His granddad Eddie had been the station master before passing on the apartment and the job to his son, Bob, and his family. But whereas once it had been a happy home for the older generations, it wasn't anymore. It had been nearly a month since their mum had walked out on their dad to start a new life in Spain with her lover. A month since she had walked away from her husband and from the family home. Everything had changed, and not for the better. The apartment above the old railway station had always been a bit messy. Ryan's mum had never been particularly house-proud, and his dad had always collected old railway items to the point of obsession, which had been the cause of many rows as to how much the place was beginning to fill up with the collection. But now, if possible, it seemed worse than ever. It didn't help that there were 3 men living there in the upstairs apartment at the moment. Ryan, his dad, and his younger brother Ethan. 2 generations of Connelly men, all trying to find a way forward in their new and strange existence. Ryan and his brother were trying to keep their dad from sinking into a deep depression. A wife walking out after 30 years of a seemingly happy marriage would do that, they thought. Was it actually a happy marriage? In truth, Ryan knew it hadn't been for a very long time. Both he and his brother had to listen to their mum's many complaints about her husband over the years. She had always been a glass-half-empty kind of person, but Ryan had assumed that it had been his mother's personality and that hopefully deep down she was happy in her marriage and living in Cranfield. It turned out that actually she was happy with neither. However bad the apartment was, though, it wasn't anywhere near as awful as the main part of the station downstairs, long since closed to the public and almost full with every piece of junk and train paraphernalia that Bob had laid his hands on. After his dad had been made redundant a couple of years ago and suddenly given early retirement, Bob's hobby had become a full-on obsession, and he had quickly become fixated on the full-sized old steam train that was in the railway workshop alongside the station. It needed major renovation work to even get the engine going once more, and each day a new oil-covered steel rod or box of valves would appear. It had been the last straw in what had already been an unstable relationship between husband and wife, and the small gap between his parents had widened to an insurmountable gulf. But Bob had been so wrapped up in his renovating the steam train that he hadn't noticed his wife growing ever more distant. Therefore, the shock of his wife walking out had hit Bob harder than anyone had expected, least of all his sons. Every evening, Bob would work on each new part of the steam engine. Normally, his dad was talkative and friendly, but the past few weeks he was almost silent. Ryan could only watch him and worry. Ryan had tried just once to gently broach the subject of the mess in the apartment, but his dad had burst into tears, and Ryan had quickly told him to forget about it, anxious not to cause his dad any more hurt. And that was the worst thing, because Ryan felt completely helpless about the situation and could do nothing but sit and twiddle his thumbs. What Ryan was really missing was his beloved cooking. It had always soothed away any stresses in his life, but now it felt as if he had lost that as well. From the very first time that his late grandmother had shown him how to bake bread, he had been hooked. His favourite lesson at school had always been cooking, and he had worked his way up through many years of hard days and late nights from the food preparation area inside many kitchens until he had reached the pinnacle as head chef in a fancy restaurant in Rome. He had rejoiced in creating amazing food, night after night, for the past 3 years. Then, a few weeks ago, he had been falsely accused of food poisoning by a celebrity customer. It had been a simple mistake, and Ryan was completely innocent, as proved later when the customer had confessed to eating a mushroom which had been rumoured to be great for weight loss. But the ensuing publicity had been fatal for the reputation of the restaurant. Suddenly, the celebrity crowd that had frequented the place found somewhere else to eat. The restaurant had moved swiftly to stop the fallout, but Ryan had ended up being sacked by the owners as they tried to save their business, and Ryan was the scapegoat. The worst thing of all had been the sneering headlines in the food pages about the sacking. His critics had crowed that Ryan had never been a great chef after all, and, in that moment, his confidence had been destroyed. He had never doubted his abilities before, but reading all the criticisms, suddenly he wondered whether he had ever been as good as he had thought. On the same day as being sacked, Ryan had received a phone call to say that his mother had walked out, and he had swiftly flown home to comfort his dad, whilst their marriage lay in tatters. Back in Cranfield, Ryan had discovered that the scandal that had surrounded his dismissal had ensured that none of the restaurants in Rome wanted to hire him. His stellar career in Italy was over. In truth, he was relieved not to have found another job for now, despite needing an income. He was still so embarrassed by the false accusation of poisoning that he was keeping his head down and hiding out in Cranfield. Worst of all, he had somehow seemed to have lost his nerve to cook or even think about food. His self-belief in his own skills had disappeared as quickly as his career. Not that he had confessed the truth to anyone, not even his brother. He had told his family that he was on a sabbatical from work, which was only half a lie. In fact, he still had to return to clear out his apartment in Rome, but he couldn't face heading back there anytime soon. Anyway, we've already had an application in reply to the job advert, so I reckon it'll all get sorted soon enough, said Ethan, bringing Ryan back to the present. Stunned by this unexpected development, Ryan stared at his brother. Who? He asked. Someone efficient and organised who will whip this place into shape in no time at all, I reckon, Ethan told him, holding out his phone. Ryan took the mobile from his brother and read the email. Words like proficient, orderly, and meticulous stood out as he scanned the screen. Words totally unsuitable for the messy station and the even messier family situation that he was surrounded by. You see? Said Ethan, looking smug as he took the mobile back. She sounds great. She sounds like a lunatic, Ryan told him, making a face. What kind of person answers a crazy job description like that? Who cares? Replied Ethan, as ever nonchalant. At the age of 31, he showed little sign of acting responsibly, although only Ryan knew that it was all an act. They had always been chalk and cheese in looks as well as personalities. Whereas Ryan was dark-haired and brown-eyed like his dad, his younger brother was blonde and blue-eyed, taking after their mum. Ethan was a laid-back joker, never taking anything seriously, and always dodging the blame for the end of his many relationships. Ryan, meanwhile, had always felt the weight of responsibility of being the older brother, never more so than in the past month, and had always had to be the sensible, dependable son. Anyway, I've sent her a reply and she's coming for an interview this afternoon, carried on Ethan. Ryan groaned in despair. What interview? He said, struggling to keep his temper under control. There's no job here. You'll think of something, Ethan told him with a shrug. Ryan looked at his brother, his eyebrows raised. Why should I be the one thinking of something? You're the one whose dumb idea this was. You can interview her. Because I'm heading to Canada tomorrow evening for that theatre job, so I figured it would be better if you did the honours, said Ethan, avoiding eye contact all of a sudden. After all, I won't be here to supervise things, so I can leave all that to you. Ryan sighed, even though he wasn't in the least bit surprised as to what his brother was telling him. Ethan had returned home at the same time as Ryan to help look after their dad when their mum had walked out. But Ryan could feel his brother's impatience to leave growing by the day. The fact that Ethan had even stayed on at home for the past couple of weeks had been incredible enough, despite his busy work schedule as a lighting specialist for large-scale events such as concerts and theatre productions. It wasn't a shock that Ethan was running away again. After all, he'd been running ever since their discovery one summer 15 years ago. Their childhood had been a happy one. Growing up in a close-knit community such as Cranfield, they had enjoyed the freedom of the countryside and the excitement of the station bustling with people from the nearby villages using the short train line into the town of Aldwych, 10 miles away. But then the small branch line had been closed, along with many others around the country due to government cuts. Their dad had reeled from the shock and found himself lost without his beloved trains to look after. A couple of weeks after the station had shut for good, Ryan had passed his driving test and bought himself a Ford Fiesta with the savings that he had made from working in a local pub, clearing tables and washing up. It had been a long, hot summer, and so he had already enjoyed a few weeks of driving around with all the windows down on the car, racing around the country lanes. However, he had promised to pick up Ethan and take him into Aldwych town so he could meet his friends, and so Ryan had headed back home late one afternoon. Having picked up his younger brother on their way out of Cranfield, they had decided to take a detour to drive through a nearby ford. It wasn't a normal route for their journey, but they were both looking forward to the splash of water if hit at the right amount of speed in the little car. However, as they slowed down to turn a corner, they had seen a couple enjoying a lover's tryst in a field beyond a large gate. Ryan had shot his brother a grin, but Ethan's face had quickly dropped and become frozen in shock. It was only when Ryan had followed his brother's gaze once more that he had realised that the woman was their mother, and that the man was the local vet, a known playboy. They had driven on in dazed silence, barely noticing the ford or even the journey. When Ryan had pulled to a stop in Aldwych to drop off Ethan, he finally turned to look at his younger brother. "What do we do?" he'd asked. "We don't do anything," Ethan had snapped. "It's none of our business." Ryan was shocked. "What about Dad?" "He doesn't need to know," Ethan had told him, frowning. "He's already reeling from the shock of the railway line closing. He doesn't need any more heartbreak at the moment." Ryan had stared at his brother in disbelief, about to disagree with him, but then Ethan had shot him a strange look. A look that suddenly changed Ryan's whole life. It was a look that told him that this wasn't the first affair that their mother had had, and that Ethan had known of others before then. "She always leaves them and goes back to him," Ethan had carried on in a dull tone. "So what does it matter?" Ryan could hear the hurt in his brother's voice and knew that the secret had caused him immense heartbreak. And now Ryan had to share in it as well. So they had agreed not to tell their dad the truth about the real state of his marriage. He was a gentle, kind soul who adored his wife, never seeming to mind her endless criticisms about his love of the railway or even how he dressed and acted. But despite protecting their dad, Ryan had always hated not being truthful with him and had lived with the guilt every day since. Soon after, he had graduated from catering college and, unwilling to participate in any more of his mother's lies, Ryan had left home, swiftly followed 3 years later by Ethan when he finished college. Over the years since, neither of them had returned home very often, except for the festive holidays. The memories whenever Ryan came back were sometimes overwhelming, and he had found himself biting his lip on many occasions to prevent from blurting out the truth. The anxiety made his stomach roll, and he always left with a sigh of relief. Ethan was even worse at dealing with it, despite his seemingly flippant nature and sarcastic humour, sometimes not even coming home for a whole year at a time. The summer, all those years ago, had been the start of a downward spiral for their happy family life. He and Ethan had tried to avoid facing up to the reality of their actions altogether by effectively running away as soon as they could to take jobs in other countries. As far as Ryan could guess, The marriage had continued the same way, after the station had closed, and the short railway line had shut for good. His dad had taken a conductor's job on the nearby main line, but had withdrawn to the workshop in his spare time, leaving their mum on her own most of the time. Presumably she had had more affairs over the years, but she had always stayed with their dad. Until now. It had happened after all. Now that she had finally left, their dad's heart had broken with the shock. Despite rushing home to rally around their dad, Ryan and Ethan still hadn't spoken about their mum leaving. Any attempts by Ryan to start a serious conversation had been brushed off by Ethan, who had spent the majority of the past few weeks catching up with local friends. With the news that Ethan was once more escaping Cranfield, and his dad still suffering from the fallout from the abrupt end of his seemingly happy marriage, Ryan had no choice but to stay. He was trapped, at least for now. Unable to cook anything like he had created in Rome, he had been preparing solid, dull meals for them, despite Ethan's protestations. He normally loved working with food, the feel and the taste. Working with Italian food had been incredible, and he missed trying out new flavours, new ingredients, and how they all meshed together. But he was still too scared to admit that perhaps he just wasn't as good a chef as he had thought. And so he felt as if both his life and career were stagnating in the middle of the English countryside. But at least the setting was glorious, he thought, walking over to look out of the upstairs window. Beyond the platform below was the railway track, a single line that used to take the passengers to Aldwych. The tracks were still there, but they now had grass and weeds growing around them. To the left were the row of cottages along Railway Lane, each built in the sandy-coloured brick that all the houses in the tiny village were made of, as well as the station. One of them belonged to his granddad Eddie, now a widower after the loss of his wife, Ryan's beloved grandmother, who had introduced him to cooking. When the station had closed all those years ago, the village had slowly begun to shut down as well. The small shop had disappeared, and, without any commuters, people and families had begun to drift away too. Even with the advent of home working in recent years, the people hadn't returned. They had chosen the much larger village of Cranbridge nearby. He could just see the church spire of St Barnabas peeping through the trees on the horizon at the end of a long path between the two villages. Cranbridge had had a makeover in recent years and appeared to be flourishing, unlike its smaller, quiet neighbour Cranfield. Only the original generation of families appeared to have stayed, such as Libby and Flora, who had been in the same school year as Ethan. Flora was now helping her grandmother run the family farm on the other side of the railway tracks. The other fields were full of clipped lavender, thanks to a recent effort over the summer. The lavender fields had been open to the public and had been very popular. Maybe life would come back to Cranfield, although with the landscape slowly turning to the rich reds and oranges of autumn, Ryan very much doubted it once winter arrived. He looked down to his right, where at the end of the railway line was the large train workshop. His dad and granddad could be found in there every day, tinkering on the steam engine, which had become the embodiment of his dad's obsession with trains. Ryan's great-grandfather had been a driver on the steam train, and it was Bob and Eddie's dream to get the abandoned locomotive up and running one more time, but Ryan doubted that would ever happen, given the amount of work required. The thought of the messy workshop led Ryan to think about the cluttered station and home as well. Now, thanks to his brother's ridiculous idea, he was stuck interviewing this woman for a job that didn't exist. For a second, he wondered whether someone could come in and wave a magic wand and make everything better for them all. The trouble was that the problems existed far beyond the mess and clutter inside the apartment. It was embedded deep in the brick walls of the family home. Nobody would be able to solve any of that, least of all a stranger. Ryan sighed as he turned away from the window. Whoever was coming for the interview, he hoped she liked a challenge. Chapter 3. Katy woke up on the sofa to an enormous hangover and a reply to an email that she couldn't even remember sending. What interview had she been invited to, she thought in horror, and for what job? She groaned and clutched her head as she stared at her phone in disbelief, reading through the previous evening's communications. What on earth had she been thinking, sending an email when she had obviously been so drunk? She looked at the empty wine bottle on the coffee table in front of her. She obviously hadn't been thinking straight, thanks to the wine. Otherwise, she would never have answered such a ridiculous advertisement. Leaning against the back of the sofa to reread the email, she tried her best to concentrate. They wanted to interview her that very afternoon, and it was 9 o'clock in the morning already. Katy sat bolt upright and groaned at the rush of movement to her delicate nerves. She had overslept, and she never overslept, let alone passed out on the sofa. But she never drank whole bottles of wine either, and her raging headache reminded her why. Think positive, she told herself as she stared at the address. The railway station in Cranfield. A railway station? It was a bit of a strange name for a hotel, but perhaps it was some kind of quirky bijou place. After all, the position was only temporary, so perhaps it was quite a small business. Katy badly just wanted to crawl into bed and sleep off her hangover, but her professional business head won that battle pretty quickly. It was an interview. Of course she would go. Who knew where it would lead in her future career? But the horror of her situation quickly returned when a quick Google revealed where Cranfield was. It was actually a small dot in the middle of the English countryside. The countryside. For the first time that morning, her eyes clicked wide open. How could she have been so foolish? She hated the countryside and never went near it. She dragged a hand through her hair, trying to think straight. Perhaps this would turn out all right. Maybe it really was some kind of fancy hotel, which would look good on her CV. There was no time to mull over her recklessness now. She had already given her word, and she needed to get ready for the train journey, which looked likely to take a couple of hours. After a quick shower, she wolfed down 2 painkillers and a large coffee, along with some toast. This was fine, she told herself, putting on some extra blusher to hide her very pale face. She put on her black skirt suit, plus her favourite high heels, which always gave her confidence as well as the extra height. Now it was October, the outside temperature was beginning to drop, so she added a smart black coat as well. She glanced at her watch once more. It was time to get going, otherwise she would miss the first of the many trains needed to get to her destination. Twice, she almost missed her connections. But finally the train pulled into Aldwych Station, which, according to Google, was the town and station closest to Cranfield, which in itself was odd if she was heading to somewhere called the railway station, she thought in bewilderment. Thankfully, she was able to find a taxi and make the last 10 miles of her long journey in relative comfort. Katy was a bit concerned that perhaps the driver didn't know where he was going, as they kept heading down narrow country lanes. But finally, they passed a small sign announcing that they had arrived in Cranfield. Her relief was short-lived, however. She had heard of country retreats, but this was ridiculous. It was a tiny village full of absolutely nothing but about 50 sandy-coloured brick houses with the occasional thatched roof. It was all very pretty, but there were no shops, no markings on the road, and on either side were long rows of fences with fields beyond. The countryside, she thought, with a grimace. Despite the beauty of the autumnal colours along the hedgerows, it was her least favourite place. She had grown up in urban cities. The countryside was messy and filled with all manner of scary things. She shuddered at the thought of being out there amongst so much nature. Katy's heart sank further as the taxi pulled up in front of a large building at the end of the lane, which had a faded British rail sign for Cranfield Station on the wall outside. She peered through the windscreen in dismay. It was the same pretty coloured brick as the rest of the village, but, apart from that, there was no denying that the whole station had an air of shabbiness about it. The window frames and doors were cracked and peeling. There were broken poster boxes just about hanging onto the wall at alarming angles. The wooden bench outside looked as if it would collapse if a small puff of wind blew over it. It was dismal, and Katy felt the same way as she got out of the taxi. It most definitely was not a bijou hotel. Or if it was a very run-down one, without many happy guests, she thought. For a second, she hesitated about whether to just get back into the taxi and leave, but then she decided that she would just treat the whole thing as a practice interview. After all, she prided herself on her professionalism. She shivered a little in the cool wind whipping up Railway Lane as she stepped up to the front door of the station. She gave a sharp rap on the door and waited. Then she knocked and waited some more before glancing at her watch. She was 5 minutes early, but surely someone was there. "You won't get any answer there," said a voice nearby. She spun around to find an elderly gentleman standing at the end of the building. He was around 80 years old and tall, with a lot of grey fluffy hair and eyebrows. But most significant of all was the filthy blue overalls he was wearing. She guessed he was some kind of handyman. Katy took a small step backwards as he headed towards her, glancing down nervously at her expensive black suit and crisp white shirt underneath. "I see," she replied. "Do you happen to know where Mr. Connelly is?" "He's standing right in front of you," the man told her with a chuckle. "Oh!" Katy took a second to mask her shock before reluctantly holding out her hand. "Mr. Connelly, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Katy Smith." "Pleasure's all mine, love," he said, taking her hand in his filthy one and giving it a hearty shake. "And please, call me Eddie." The elderly gentleman certainly didn't look like the owner of a sought-after hotel, she thought, glancing in dismay at her oil-smeared hand. Eddie broke into a beaming smile. "Well then, Katy Smith, what can I do for you?" "I'm here for the job interview," she replied, by now wondering whether she was still dreaming. "A job interview?" said Eddie, looking astonished. "I don't know anything about a job interview." Shocked, Katy brought out her phone and looked at the email. "It says here that I'm to meet Mr. Connelly at 2 p.m. at this address." Had the whole day been some kind of ghastly mistake, she wondered, with a soft groan. "That would be me, Grandad." They both spun around, whereupon Katy saw a man in his early 30s walking along the side of the building towards them. Her first thought was that he was as tall as his granddad. Her second thought was that he was good-looking and, thankfully, not wearing a filthy overall covered in grease and who knew what. He had dark hair and was dressed in jeans and a sweatshirt. Her last thought was that he looked to be extremely grumpy, and the target of his bad mood appeared to be her. "I'm Ryan Connelly. Welcome to Cranfield Station," he told her, before they exchanged a firm handshake. He immediately looked down at his hand, which was now greasy, and added, "I can see you've already met my granddad. Let's get this charade over with, shall we?" Charade? Katy gave a start at the word. What on earth had she got herself into? As they continued to look at each other with disbelief, Katy decided that the whole day was obviously going to be a complete disaster, and promised herself that she would never drink any alcohol ever again. Chapter 4. Ryan tried not to stare in shock at the woman in front of him. He wasn't sure who he had been expecting to arrive for the ridiculous interview that his brother had set up, but it most certainly was not the stylish, attractive, dark-haired woman in front of him. Katy Smith was a huge surprise. Standing there in an extremely smart business suit and high heels, she looked like an alien that had just landed in sleepy Cranfield. "So, the hotel appears to be closed at present," she said, breaking into the awkward silence. "What hotel?" he asked, not understanding what she was talking about. There had been no mention of a hotel on the advertisement, had there? "This is my father's home." "What's all this about then, my boy?" asked his granddad, looking thoroughly confused as he glanced from Ryan to the stranger. "Ethan posted a joke interview for someone to tidy up the station," Ryan told him, rolling his eyes. "Did he now?" replied Eddie, nodding thoughtfully. Excuse me, this is a practical joke, said Katy, her blue eyes glaring at him. She appeared to be about to explode with anger. Well, look, began Ryan, about to apologise when he was quickly interrupted. No, you look, snapped Katy, her voice getting higher with each irate word. I've just travelled for 3 hours on various trains, plus a taxi journey to get here, and now you're telling me that the job doesn't even exist. So the station isn't a hotel and doesn't need organising. Is that what you're saying? No, said Ryan, finally able to get a word in. It might not be a hotel, but it most definitely needs organising. He brought out the front door key to the main part of the station that he rarely used these days. The separate door to the apartment upstairs where the family lived was actually at the far end of the building around the corner, but the mess of the station was surely bad enough to put anyone off.